The monitor screamed. Not one monitor. All of them. The entire private ward at Seoul General Hospital erupted into alarm at 2:47 in the morning, and every nurse on the night shift froze for exactly 1 second before training took over. Every nurse except one. Adaeze Okafor was already moving before the sound fully registered, her sneakers hitting the polished floor at a run, her hands reaching for the crash cart before anyone called for it. The man in room 7 was seizing. She burst through the door and took everything in under 3 seconds. Male patient, mid-40s, powerfully built even in a hospital gown. 2 men in suits pressed against the far wall, completely useless, one of them already reaching for a phone, and 4-line tangled at his wrist, his body rigid and trembling against the bed rails. Adaeze moved past the suited men like they were furniture. She stabilized his airway, called out orders to the nurse who appeared in the doorway behind her, kept her hands steady and her voice even. Not because she was unafraid, because fear had a place, and that place was not here, not now, not while someone needed her hands to be sure. 3 minutes later, the seizure broke. His body went slack. His breathing evened out. One of the suited men exhaled so loudly it sounded like a prayer. Adaeze checked his pupils, noted his pulse, updated his chart with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times. Only then did she actually look at him. At his face. Strong jaw, graying at the temples, a long scar running from his left ear toward his jaw that no hospital had given him. She had heard the whispers when he was admitted 4 days ago. Sung-jin Choi. She did not know exactly what that name meant in certain parts of Seoul. She knew enough. She finished her notes and turned to leave. His hand caught her wrist. Not rough, not threatening, just there. His eyes were open, glassy from the episode, but looking directly at her. He said in Korean, his voice raw, "Don't tell them how scared I looked." She looked down at his hand on her wrist, looked back at his face, then said in clean, precise Korean with an accent that made his eyes shift slightly in surprise, "That's not in the chart." She removed his hand gently, set it back on the bed, and walked out. She stood in the hallway for a moment, breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her mother taught her when she was 7 years old and the world felt too large. Then she picked up her clipboard and kept moving, because that was what you did. You kept moving. She did not know, standing in that corridor at 3 in the morning, that the man in room 7 had just become the most important patient of her life. She did not know that 6 months would turn into something neither of them had a word for. She did not know that the universe was already arranging things with the particular cruelty and grace that it reserved for people who had stopped expecting miracles. All she knew was that her shift ended at 6, her feet hurt, and the man in room 7 had not wanted anyone to see his fear. She understood that more than she wanted to admit. If you're the kind of person who believes that love has a specific place where it is allowed to happen, that it requires the right setting, the right timing, the right kind of people, then the story of Adaeze and Sung-jin is going to trouble you. Because it began in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and grief, between a woman who had fought for everything she had and a man who had taken everything he wanted, and it did not ask either of them for permission. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Stories like this one come every week, and you do not want to miss what is coming. Now, back to Adaeze. She had come from Enugu with 1 suitcase, a scholarship letter, and the kind of stubbornness that her mother called a gift and her professors called a problem. She had learned Korean in 14 months because she refused to be the nurse who needed everything translated. She had worked double shifts for 3 years to send money home without telling anyone it was hard. She was 29 years old, she was exceptional at her job, and she had learned very efficiently how to keep a wall between what she felt and what she showed. The wall was useful, especially on this ward. Her supervisor called her in the next morning and told her she was being assigned permanently to Sung-jin Choi's care. Adaeze kept her face neutral while her supervisor explained that he had refused 3 previous nurses. 1 for crying, 1 for whispering on her phone, 1 for what he described only as an unacceptable energy. Adaeze nodded once and asked if there was anything specific in his care plan that required special attention. Her supervisor paused, then said, quietly, his diagnosis is terminal. Stage 4. 6 months, probably less if the stress continues. He knows. He has known for 2 weeks, and he has not processed it well. Adaeze said, understood. She knocked on room 7's door before entering. He was sitting up, facing the window, soul laid out behind the glass like something he had conquered and grown tired of. He did not turn around. He said, if you are here to be gentle with me, leave. Adaeze said, I am here to check your blood pressure and review your medication schedule. A pause. Then he turned. He looked at her the way people look at something that has surprised them without meaning to. Like she had walked into the frame of a picture he thought he already understood. He said, you were here last night. Yes. You didn't panic. No. Why not? She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm with practiced ease and said, panicking doesn't help the patient. It only helps the person panicking feel like they're doing something. She noted his reading, wrote it down. Your pressure is still elevated. That will continue if you don't sleep. He watched her the entire time she worked, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, in a way that made her feel like he was trying to solve something. Then he reached under his pillow and pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out to her. She took it, unfolded it, read it. It was a list, handwritten in Korean, the characters slightly uneven, like someone who was used to having other people write things for him had sat down and done it himself, because this particular thing was too private to dictate. 5 items. Simple ones. The kind of list that a very powerful man writes when he realizes that power has never once given him what he actually wanted. She read it twice. Then she looked at him. He said, I have 6 months. Maybe less. I have spent 30 years building things I cannot take with me. Before I go, I want to do those 5 things. Not with a bodyguard. Not with someone I'm paying. With someone who is not afraid of me. Adaeze folded the paper carefully and set it on his tray. She said, I'm your nurse, not your assistant. He said, my doctor says that stress is accelerating my condition. That peace of mind, purpose, and human connection are the only things likely to extend whatever time I have left. This list is not leisure. It is medical. He held her gaze. Help me as a nurse. She looked at him for a long time, at the scar on his jaw, at the exhaustion behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the seizure last night, and everything to do with the weight of a life that had gotten very complicated very fast. She picked the list back up. She said, Number 3, hearing someone play piano live. I know a conservatory student who volunteers here on Thursdays. He said nothing. She said, I'll arrange it. She walked out before he could respond. And in the hallway, just for a second, the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. Something that was not yet sure of itself. But it was there. The sunrise from Namsan Tower happened on a Tuesday. Adaeze had spent 3 days navigating the paperwork required to authorize a pre-dawn therapeutic outing for a patient whose security detail required its own authorization layer. She had written emotional wellness intervention in the clinical rationale box and kept her expression completely professional when her supervisor read it twice. It was approved. Barely. They arrived at the tower at 4:50 in the morning. 2 of Sung's men waited at the base. Adaeze and Sung walked to the railing alone. The city below them, still dark in most places, lit up in others, breathing in that slow way that cities breathe before the world wakes up and starts demanding things from them. Sung stood at the railing and looked out and said nothing for a very long time. Adaeze waited. She was good at waiting. It was one of the things that made her excellent at her job and occasionally difficult in personal relationships. This ability to simply be still and let silence exist without trying to fill it. Finally, he said, I built 3 of those towers. She looked out at the skyline. Which ones? He pointed. She followed his finger to 3 buildings she passed regularly without thinking about. Glass and steel, unremarkable from a distance, significant up close. She said, they're beautiful. He said, everything looks beautiful when you're about to lose it. She turned to look at him. The city light caught his face at an angle that showed every year and every decision and something underneath all of it that was much younger than the rest of him. Something that had been waiting, maybe, for a morning like this one, for a railing and a sleeping city, and someone standing next to him who had no reason to pretend. She said, "Is that why you never noticed before? Because you weren't losing it yet." He looked at her. "Probably. Then maybe the diagnosis gave you something back." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, that is either the wisest thing anyone has said to me in years or the strangest." She said, "With me, those are usually the same thing." He almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive, but it tried. That was enough. That was, Adaeze thought, actually quite a lot. They stood there until the sky went from black to gray to a color that didn't have a clean name, something between gold and pink, and the particular shade of hope that only exists for about 4 minutes before the sun fully commits to rising. Neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to. The city below them was waking up, and for once, Sung-jin Choi was watching something happen instead of making it happen, and the expression on his face was something Adaeze filed away carefully in the part of herself she was pretending not to pay attention to. The street food came next. Adaeze found a market vendor near the hospital who opened at 6 and made tteokbokki that smelled like every good morning in Seoul condensed into one pot. She showed up with Sung on a quiet Wednesday, both of them in plain clothes, his men a careful distance behind. He stood at the stall with a paper cup of rice cakes and gochujang sauce and ate standing up like someone who had not eaten street food in 20 years, which turned out to be exactly accurate. He got sauce on his sleeve. He looked at it. Then he looked at her with an expression that was so completely lost. This man who ran a criminal organization looking at a sauce stain like it was an unsolvable problem. And Adaeze laughed. A real one. The kind that came from somewhere unguarded and arrived before she could decide whether to let it. He stared at her. She tried to compose herself. Failed. Pressed her fingers to her mouth and made it worse. He said, "It's not that funny." She said, still laughing, "It is a little funny." And then something extraordinary happened. Sung-jin Choi, who had not laughed, genuinely laughed, in longer than he could accurately remember, laughed. Quietly, briefly, like it surprised him on the way out. But it was real. Adaeze heard it and felt something shift in the air between them, something that had been sitting at a careful professional distance, suddenly deciding it was tired of being careful. Walking back, he told her about a man named Director Lim. He didn't explain who Lim was. He didn't contextualize it or frame it carefully. He just said, "There's a man I wronged early on. He had something I wanted, and I took it from him in a way that left him with nothing. I told myself it was business. I have thought about him more in the last 2 weeks than in the 30 years since." Adaeze listened. She did not look horrified. She did not look forgiving. She looked like someone absorbing information with full attention, which was somehow more powerful than either of those things. She said, "Carrying that guilt all this time, did it protect him?" He said, "No." "Did it change what you did?" "No." "Then the only thing it's been doing is hurting you." She paused. "Which isn't absolution. What you did to him was wrong. But punishing yourself quietly for 30 years in private isn't justice either. It's just wait." He said, after a long moment, "You don't talk like a nurse." She said, "I talk like someone who grew up watching people carry things they were never meant to carry alone." She looked ahead. "My mother used to say, the things we refuse to put down are the things that bury us." He was quiet for the rest of the walk. But it was a different kind of quiet. Not the closed, armored silence he had carried when she first met him. Something more like the quiet of a room after a window has been opened. Still, but moving. The piano happened on Thursday. The conservatory student's name was Ji-hoon, 22 years old, nervous around patients in a way that made him endearing. Adaeze had arranged a small room off the physiotherapy wing, chairs set up, an upright piano that had seen better decades but was tuned and willing. Sung sat closest to the door. Adaeze noticed. She said nothing. Ji-hoon played a Chopin nocturne, the one in E-flat major, the kind of piece that does not ask your permission before going directly into the center of you. Adaeze watched Sung from the corner of her eye. He sat completely still, his hands on his knees, his jaw slightly tight, the expression of a man who is fighting something and losing and not entirely sorry about it. When Ji-hoon finished, the room held the silence for a few seconds the way good music always makes a room do. Adaeze said quietly, "Are you all right?" Sung said, without moving. My mother used to hum. When she cooked. When she thought no one was listening. He paused. I hadn't thought about that in 30 years. Adaeze reached over, placed her hand over his, briefly. Not romantically, or not only romantically. The way you touch someone when words are insufficient and presence is the only honest response. He looked down at her hand. Then he turned his hand over, slowly, and held hers. Neither of them made it into something it wasn't ready to be. But it was something. They both knew it was something. And knowing it was enough to make the rest of that afternoon feel like it had been lit from the inside. The East Coast trip required a genuine battle. Adaeze submitted the request, had it denied, rewrote the clinical justification, had a frank and slightly intense conversation with the head of her ward, and finally received grudging approval for a one-night supervised therapeutic excursion. She suspected her supervisor approved it partly out of curiosity about what she was doing with this man who had terrorized the entire nursing staff before her arrival. They drove to Gyeongdongjin as the afternoon softened into evening. Sung's men stayed at the road. Adaeze and Sung walked down to the water together, the East Sea ahead of them, gray-green and enormous, completely indifferent to both of them in the way that oceans are indifferent. Not cruelly, just honestly. Sung stood at the edge of where the sand was still dry and stared at the water. He said, I've been on yachts on this water. I have closed deals on this water. I have never just stood next to it. Adaeze took her sandals off and walked to where the waves were reaching. Cold water over her feet. She turned back to look at him. Come here. He looked at his shoes. At the water. At her. Then he took off his shoes with the slightly stiff dignity of a man, doing something he had decided to do, whether it was dignified or not, and walked to the edge. The water hit his feet, and he inhaled sharply. It's cold. It's the ocean. It's supposed to be cold. He stood there. The water came and went. He exhaled slowly, like something nodding. She said, Tell me something about before. Before all of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I grew up in Incheon. Small apartment. My father was gone by the time I was 6. My mother worked 2 jobs. I decided very young that I would never, that no one would ever have power over me again. Over what I could have. Where I could go. He paused. I kept that promise. And I lost almost everything that mattered doing it. She said, almost. He looked at her. Almost. She held his gaze. The ocean moved around their feet, cold and vast, and completely unconcerned with what was happening between them. She told him about Enugu, about her mother who sold fabric in a market with a voice like ceremony and hands that could make anything beautiful. About the night she got her scholarship and her mother sat on the floor of their kitchen and cried quietly for 20 minutes, not from sadness, but from the particular joy that arrives when you have prayed for something so long that when it comes you almost don't know how to hold it. She said, I became a nurse because everyone in my community treated illness like shame, like something to be hidden. I wanted to be the person who walked toward it, who said, this is not shameful. This is human. Let me help. He said, you are the most unafraid person I have ever met. She said, I am afraid of plenty. You don't show it. I show it to the right people. She paused. Eventually, he looked at her for a long moment. The sky behind her was doing extraordinary things. He said, very quietly, Adaeze. Just her name. Nothing attached to it. Just the sound of it in his voice, which was lower than usual and stripped of everything practiced, like he had spent 30 years building a very impressive performance, and was, for the first time, not performing. She said, Sung. They walked back when it got fully dark, and when the path narrowed and their hands were close, they found each other without discussion, fingers lacing together with the ease of something that had been waiting for permission. If you're still here, and I think you are, drop a comment below and tell me. Did you see what was coming? Because what happens next changes everything. Like the video, if Adaeze has your whole heart right now. She has mine. The morning the trial drug announcement came, the hospital felt different. Adaeze noticed it before she understood it. A particular electricity in the air of the oncology wing, nurses speaking in slightly faster voices, a cluster of doctors near the conference room with the focused energy of people who had received news they were still organizing. She stopped one of the junior residents in the hallway and asked what was happening. He said, a pharmaceutical trial. Breakthrough compound. Works on aggressive stage for presentations. Early results are extraordinary. Remission rates that don't exist on anything currently approved. He paused, checking himself, remembering perhaps that she had a patient with exactly that presentation. There's one spot left in the Seoul general cohort. She was still for 1 second. Then she walked to Sung's room with a completely even expression and sat down in the chair beside his bed and told him. He listened. His face did not change. When she finished, he said, "One spot. Yes. And I qualify." "You qualify." He was quiet. She watched him. Outside the window, Seoul was doing what Seoul always did. Moving, building, conducting 10,000 negotiations simultaneously. Sung looked out at it with the expression of a man checking his balance before making a decision. He said, "Who else qualifies?" She paused. "I don't have the full cohort list." "Find out." She found out. It took 2 hours and a conversation with the trial coordinator that required more persistence than the coordinator was initially comfortable with. She brought the information back to his room and sat down again and looked at him. She said, "There is a 9-year-old boy, 2 floors up, same cancer presentation, caught later, no viable alternative treatment path. His family has been on a waiting list for this trial for 4 months." The room was very quiet. Sung looked at the wall for a long time. She watched his face and saw something happening in it that she did not want to name yet, because naming it would make it real, and real things, once arrived, could not be managed back into abstract. She said, "Carefully, Sung, this spot could significantly extend your life." "Possibly. How old did you say he was?" 9. He nodded once. Slowly, like something settling. He said, "He has a whole list left to write." She did not breathe for a moment. He said, "Bring me the form." "Sung," with his name on it. "Not mine." She looked at him. She looked at this man who had spent 30 years taking what he wanted from the world, sitting in a hospital bed in a gown that cost the same as everything else in the room combined, making the single most generous decision she had ever witnessed anyone make. And she felt something in her chest that she had been carefully managing for weeks, now simply stopped cooperating. She said, "You understand what you are giving up." He said, "I understand what he would be losing." She stood up, walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. Her back was to him. She said, without turning, "You are a better man than you think you are." He said, "Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation." She almost laughed. Her eyes were doing something she was not going to permit in his room. So she walked out and down the hallway and around the corner and stood facing a wall for approximately 45 seconds while she composed herself. A passing nurse gave her a look. She straightened up and went to get the form. She did not know, walking back with the enrollment form in her hand, that the universe was already preparing its next move. 3 days later, the hospital's administrative wing experienced what the official report would later describe as a catastrophic records management failure. 2 patients admitted within hours of each other, same wing, similar demographics. Imaging labeled during a shift change by a technician who was on his 14th consecutive hour and made an error that would define the rest of his career. The scans had been switched. Adaeze heard about it from her supervisor, who called her into the office with the expression of someone delivering information they had not fully processed yet. She sat in the chair across the desk and listened. Her supervisor said Sung-jin Choi's imaging results had been cross-labeled with another patient on intake. The stage 4 presentation, the aggressive spread, the 6-month prognosis, none of it belonged to Sung. What Sung had was serious. It was not minor, but it was operable, treatable. Caught at a stage where surgery followed by targeted therapy gave him a strong statistical probability of recovery. His actual prognosis, correctly read, was measured not in months but in years. Adaeze sat very still. Her supervisor said, I know you have been his primary nurse. This is extraordinary news." "Are you?" "I'm fine," Adaeze said. "I'll tell him." She walked to his room. She knocked. She entered. He was sitting up, reading something on his phone, and he looked at her face when she walked in and immediately set the phone down. Because he always noticed. In the weeks she had known him, he had become, with unsettling accuracy, a reader of her face. He said, "What happened?" She told him, clearly, all of it. The error, the correct scans, the actual diagnosis, the actual prognosis. She watched his face move through disbelief and then a kind of careful stillness as he processed it. And then something that was not quite relief, because it was too complicated to be simply relief. His lieutenants, who somehow knew within minutes the way people in his world always knew things, appeared in the doorway with expressions of barely contained celebration. One of them looked genuinely emotional. Sung looked at them and made a small gesture with his hand that meant, "Not yet, go." And they withdrew. He said, "The trial drug." "The boy," she said, "the enrollment already processed." "That does not change." Something moved through his expression. Settled, like the decision already made had just been confirmed as exactly right. He said, "Good." Then he looked at her. He had been looking at her the entire time with that reading expression, the one she had stopped trying to deflect because it got through regardless. He said, "Adaeze, something is wrong." She said, "Nothing is wrong. This is good news. I know what your good news face looks like. This isn't it." She looked at him. The window behind him had soul in it again, same as always, indifferent and glittering. She thought about how many times she had stood in this room and been entirely honest with him about hard things. About his prognosis, about his guilt, about the boy upstairs and the form with the child's name on it. She had been honest every single time. She had never once been dishonest in this room. She said, "I had some results come back." He was absolutely still. She said, "I have been having some symptoms. I told myself it was fatigue, overwork, the stress of the ward." She paused. "I had labs drawn 3 weeks ago, and I have been slow to open the final report." He said, "Adaeze, I opened it this morning." The room was completely silent. Outside, Seoul moved and built and negotiated. In here, everything had stopped. She said, "It is serious. It is not the same as what you were misdiagnosed with, but it is serious enough that the road ahead is," she stopped. Steadied. "The road ahead is long." She had managed it perfectly. Her voice had been even. Her posture had been professional. She was absolutely, completely fine. Then Sung said her name again. Quietly. Just that. And the evenness broke. Not completely. Just at the edges. A slight change around her eyes. A single breath that came out less steadily than the one before it. He said, "Come here." She said, "I'm your nurse." He said, "Adaeze, come here." She crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his bed, and he reached over and took her hand the same way she had taken his in the piano room. The way you hold someone when words are embarrassingly inadequate. And she looked at the window and breathed. He said, "You walked toward hard things your whole life." She said, "I know." "Then you already know how to do this." She said, "Knowing how to do something doesn't make it easier to face." He said, "No, but you don't have to face it the same way you faced everything else." He paused. "You don't have to face this one alone." She turned to look at him. His face was completely open. No performance, no armor, nothing managed. Just him, this man who had taken 30 years to become a person capable of this moment. Looking at her with an expression that was so honest, it was almost difficult to look at directly. She said, "You have your own recovery ahead of you." He said, "Then we'll be in the same building." Very convenient. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. He watched her make it with an expression like someone watching something valuable and irreplaceable. She said, "You are impossible." He said, "You knew that before any of this." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she nodded. Once. The way she had nodded at him when he signed the form with the boy's name. The nod that meant, "This is true, and true things deserve acknowledgement." The morning she was admitted to the hospital as a patient, Adaeze packed a single bag. She was efficient about it. Deliberate. She chose the bag she had brought from Enugu 7 years ago, worn at the handles, a small patch on one corner where she had repaired it herself rather than replace it. She folded 3 sets of clothes. She placed her mother's photograph on top. She zipped it closed and sat on the edge of her bed in her apartment for 3 minutes looking at nothing in particular. Then she picked up the bag and went. Her ward was not Sung's ward. The hospital, in one of those arrangements that felt designed by something with a sense of irony, had placed her 2 floors below him. Her room had the same style of window, different angle of Seoul. She sat on her bed and looked out at her portion of the skyline and thought about how strange it was to be on this side of things. The bed, the gown, the chart on the door that represented you as data, after years of being the one who managed the data, the one who walked in. She was still sitting like that when her door opened. Sung-jin Choi walked in wearing his own hospital clothes. He had refused to go home during his pre-surgical preparation period, which his doctors found unusual and his security team found logistically complex, and which Adaeze, when she heard about it, understood immediately. He walked in and sat down in the chair beside her bed with the complete ease of someone who had decided where he was going to be and had nothing further to negotiate about it. She said, "You are supposed to be resting." He said, "I am resting. I'm sitting." She looked at him. Sung, Adaeze. She almost said something practical. She could feel it forming. Something about his pre-surgical protocol, something about the importance of his own recovery, something that would let her manage the moment into something professionally appropriate. She had been managing things into professional appropriateness her entire career. She let it go. She said, "I'm scared." He said, "I know. I spent so long being the person who wasn't scared in the room. I don't entirely know what to do with it when it's me." He said, "You do the same thing you did for me. You let someone sit with you. You let it be real without letting it be everything." He paused. "You let someone who?" He stopped. Started again. "You let someone who cares about you be in the room." She looked at him. She had been looking at this face for weeks now, had memorized the scar, the lines around his eyes that appeared when something genuinely amused him, the way his jaw set when he was deciding something. It was a face that had frightened people. It was a face that at some point she couldn't precisely identify, had become the face she most wanted to see when things were hard. She said, "How did this happen?" He said, "A seizure at 3 a.m. and a nurse who didn't panic." She said, "I almost panicked." "But you didn't." "No." "That," he said, "is the whole story." She looked at her hands in her lap. He was still holding one of them. She thought about the list, his list, with its 5 careful items, written by a man who had everything and nothing and knew the difference finally, too late, or maybe exactly in time. She thought about the tower and the cold ocean water, and Ji-hoon playing Chopin in the small room, and a man remembering his mother's hum after 30 years of forgetting. She thought about a 9-year-old boy 2 floors up who was, according to the latest nursing notes, she had no business reading but had read anyway, responding well to the trial drug. Improving. Measurably, genuinely improving. She said, "The boy is getting better." Sung said, "I know." And the way he said it, quiet and complete and unbothered by the cost of the decision, made her understand something about him that she had been understanding in pieces for weeks and was now seeing whole. He had spent 30 years building an empire on taking. He had spent the last weeks of what he thought was his life learning to give. And it had not diminished him. It had not made him smaller or softer in any way that mattered. It had made him, for the first time, someone he could recognize. She said, "I don't have a bucket list." He said, "I know." He reached into the pocket of his hospital clothes. She had not noticed until now that he was holding something, and placed a folded piece of paper on her tray. She looked at him. He nodded once. She unfolded it. It was a list, written in his handwriting, in Korean, with something else beside the Korean, each item translated or transcribed into another language, phonetically spelled, clearly labored over, clearly researched, clearly done with the kind of care that a man gives to something that matters more than his pride. It was Igbo, imperfect Igbo, phonetically approximate, grammatically earnest, the handwriting slightly careful the way handwriting gets when someone is writing in characters they are not certain of, but is determined to get right anyway. He had written her list in her language. Badly. Beautifully. She read it, and her face did the thing she had spent 7 years in Seoul preventing it from doing in front of other people. She felt the warmth arrive behind her eyes and did not stop it. The list read, "Watch the sun rise over Lagos Harbor, even if it's from a photograph for now. Eat your mother's soup. Tell her it was worth every sacrifice. Play music so loud the neighbors complain. You are allowed to be joyful. Let someone take care of you. Just once. Let it happen without managing it. Stay." The last one. She read it twice. Stay. She looked at him. He was watching her with the open, unguarded expression that she had learned to recognize as the most honest version of him, the one that only arrived when he had made a decision he was entirely at peace with. She said, "Number 4? Right now." He said, "What do you need?" She said, "Just stay. That's all. Just stay in the room." He said, "Done." He did not move from the chair. He settled into it the way someone settles into something they intend to be in for a long time, and she leaned back against her pillow and looked at the window, her portion of Seoul glittering in the afternoon light. And for the first time in longer than she wanted to calculate, she stopped managing the moment and simply lived inside it. The boy upstairs got better, slowly, then steadily, then in a way that made his doctors use words they were professionally cautious about using. Words like remarkable, words like extraordinary. His mother stopped Adaeze in the hallway during one of Adaeze's walking recovery sessions and gripped both her hands and could not find words in any language sufficient to the feeling. So she simply held on. Adaeze looked down the corridor and found Sung there, leaning against the wall with his arms folded in the particular way that meant he was feeling something he had decided to be quiet about. When their eyes met, he lifted his chin. She nodded. The same nod. The one that meant, "This is true, and true things deserve to be witnessed." Sung's surgery went well. Recovery was long and not graceful. It turned out, a deeply impatient patient, which Adaeze pointed out with significant satisfaction from her own adjacent recovery. They occupied neighboring convalescence rooms for 2 weeks. The nursing staff, who had begun to grasp the shape of what was happening between them, handled it with a professionalism that was occasionally strained by the fact that it was genuinely one of the stranger and more affecting situations any of them had encountered. Adaeze began her treatment. It was hard in the ways that treatment is hard. The days that arrived without warning that required everything and gave nothing back, the recalibration of a body that had always been reliable, the learning of a new relationship with her own limits. On the difficult days, Sung sat in the chair. On the days, she felt strong enough to be funny about it. He matched her, and the room held something that was not diminished by what was hard in it, but somehow enlarged by it. She called her mother from the hospital bed on a Thursday evening. She had not told her mother about the diagnosis yet. She had been preparing the right words, organizing the conversation, managing it. She had the phone in her hand, and Sung was in the chair, and she looked at him, and he said nothing, just looked back, and she dialed. Her mother answered on the second ring. Adaeze said, "Mama," and then she said the rest of it plainly and completely without managing it, and her mother was quiet for a long moment, and then said in Igbo something that meant approximately, "You are my strongest thing, and strength is allowed to need holding." She held the phone to her ear and cried properly for the first time since her own diagnosis. Not carefully, not professionally, just fully, with her whole face, the way her mother had cried on the kitchen floor the night the scholarship arrived. The way you cry when something is real enough to require it. Sung did not say anything. He reached over and held her hand. He stayed in the room. She realized, crossing off number 4. The narrator's voice arrives one last time as Seoul moves outside the window, unhurried and ongoing. Sung-jin Choi came to this hospital believing he was dying and ended up learning how to live. Adaeze Okafor came to this hospital to save lives and ended up allowing someone to show up for hers. Neither of them planned it. Both of them needed it. He gave a child a chance without being asked to. She walked toward the hardest thing without flinching until the hardest thing was her own life, and even then, she did not look away. There is a list on a bedside tray in a hospital room in Seoul. One item has been crossed off. For remain. That is not a tragedy. That is a beginning. And if you have made it to the end of this story, then you already know what kind of person you are. You're the kind who stays. Subscribe so you are here for the next one. Leave a comment below. I want to know, which moment stayed with you? Share this with someone who needs a story that does not flinch. And come back. There's always another name on the list.